Hey everybody, Mr. Sunday here again. Well, we were right in the middle of the tales of Napoleon, and I think the last thing we said was he made himself the emperor of this great French empire that he has created. The original country of France and all these other places that he'd either conquered or made alliances with because they just could not beat Napoleon on the battlefield. He was so brilliant of a general, one of the greatest in all world history. And I think I mentioned, as a leader of France, he was actually pretty fair and pretty good at running a country. Things seemed to be going really, really well. But Napoleon isn't perfect. He makes three big mistakes later on in his life. One of the first mistakes he made was against Great Britain. Great Britain, to the north of him, he could not conquer. They were really good on the battlefield, but they were excellent on the sea. They had the best navy in the world, and he had been chased about by the British Navy quite a bit, and he wanted to ruin them economically. So he thought the best thing he could do would be to surround most of the British Isles with French ships and watch their main shipping ports. And any ships that came out, they would stop and take all the goods off, or any ships coming in from other countries to trade with Great Britain, they would stop and raid all of their goods, and he thought that maybe he could ruin them economically. But it backfired, because when the British learned of this, they did the exact same thing to him. They put their navy along the coast of France and blockaded their ports. Now, the British are better at it than the French are. So the French economy starts to be hurt by this blockade as well, but it doesn't stop. They keep doing it for years and years. Incidentally, this blockade added to something of American history. Because the British were stopping any ships coming into France, well, the United States wasn't at war with France or Great Britain, so we were trying to trade with both countries. And whenever an American ship would sail to a French port, the British ships would stop the American ship, and they'd get on board, and they start taking the goods off. Oh, you can't, sorry about that, you can't trade this with the French now, we're at war with them, so we're going to have to take it from you. And they took it a step further. They would impress American sailors. That means they would steal American sailors and force them to work on British ships. They're like, hi mate, what language are you speaking? I'm speaking English. Oh, you must be British then. Come on, you can be with us. No, I'm an American sailor. No, take him. And they would steal American sailors. And this went on for a couple of years, and the United States declared war on Great Britain because of it. It was called the War of 1812. Well, that was the first mistake Napoleon made, trying to blockade the British ports. The second mistake he made was he had conquered Spain, and he had invaded Spain, and the king of Spain had passed away, and so Napoleon decided to put his little brother Joseph on the throne of Spain to be kind of like a puppet king for him. And the Spanish didn't like that. And even though they couldn't beat Napoleon on a battlefield, the Spanish started what they called guerrilla warfare. It's from the Spanish word guerra, which means war. And what they would do is they would try to fight him. It would be, we would call it like terrorist war. They would hit and run, and hide. And Napoleon had to keep sending more troops down. And because they were right next to Portugal, the British were coming down into Portugal and then trying to work their way into Spain also. And it turned into a big, long affair. It was called the Peninsular War. And Napoleon lost quite a few troops trying to fight off this guerrilla warfare because he didn't really know who the enemy was. So it was a big mistake that he made by putting his brother on the throne. The third mistake was, and this is the biggest one, is Napoleon had one other great empire rival at the time. It was the Russian Empire, way out here to the east. It was enormous. And they had a brand new czar. His name was Alexander. And Alexander he had just as big an ego as Napoleon did. And they kind of clashed with each other. And Napoleon vowed he would conquer this Russian Empire. So in the summer of 1812, Napoleon led an army of 400,000 French troops and marched across Europe into Russia. And when he got there, he started fighting the Russians. And the Russians, their tactic was they would fight a short battle and then they would retreat. And Napoleon's army would pursue further into Russian territory. And then they'd meet up with the Russians again, and the Russians would lose, and they would retreat some more. And Napoleon kept pursuing the Russians deeper and deeper and deeper into enemy territory. Now, this was a trick. The Russians were purposely losing and moving further into Russia because they knew Napoleon had such a huge ego, he would keep pursuing. To maintain a supply line all the way back to France into Russia was a very difficult thing to do at that time because all they had were horses and carriages. They didn't have any modern things like we have today. And so Napoleon, the capital at the time, the Ministry of Capital was way out here in Moscow, and he had a goal of capturing Moscow, and he thought that would end the war. Well, they got to Moscow about October, and all the while the Russians were retreating, they kept burning all the crops. So that when the French would show up and take over, their food supply would get shorter and shorter. When they got to Moscow, the city had been evacuated. Sounds kind of familiar. Remember when King Xerxes made it into Athens and the Athenians had evacuated? Well, the Tsar, Alexander, had also evacuated Russia. There were a few people there, but for the most part, everyone was gone. And so this capture of the city was kind of a hollow victory. And Napoleon thought, well, they got to come back sometime. This is their capital. They got to come back. We'll just wait here. Well, it's starting to be December, and they're in Russia, and guess what happens? It gets cold. So it starts getting colder and colder. When Napoleon left, they left in June. Now it's getting into the winter months, and he doesn't have the right supplies for his soldiers. They don't have winter uniforms and big winter coats to keep them warm. Napoleon gets very discouraged, and he decides to start to retreat, something he had never done before. As Napoleon starts retreating from Russia, this is when Alexander and the Russians begin their attack on the French. So as the French are trying to just get the hell out of Russia, they have to fight battle after battle all the way back. And their men are freezing to death. They're starving to death. They're being shot at, and getting killed in major battles. There are guys deserting. Napoleon starts losing his army by the thousands and thousands, and he is not being victorious at all. And he gets so far, he gets to, it's not on my map here, he gets to a city on the coast up here called Vilnius, and he hears news back in France that there's trouble with the government, and so he does something. He leaves his army to get out of there without him, and he takes a boat back to try to get back to Paris. And then he regroups with his army later. He went into Russia with 400,000 troops. How many got back to Russia? Less than 40,000 men. He had lost so many soldiers on this expedition. It was disastrous for him. Now, after his troops get home, now's the time all the other countries that had been defeated by him in the past think, now's the time to attack him. Now we can form a coalition and go against him. So Prussia and Austria and Great Britain and even a few other places, Sweden, they decide we are going to go against Napoleon now. So they put their armies together and start to march toward France. Napoleon hurriedly gets some kind of an army together and goes out and meets them. And they meet at this place called Leipzig, which is in Germany, and they fight this great big battle. It's called the Battle of the Nations. And Napoleon loses this battle. And then all these countries, they make him an offer. They say, well, you can still be emperor, but we're going to take back some of the land that you took away from our countries, and you got to give us a decision if that's what you want to do. Well, he waited and waited and waited, and finally they said, hey, that's too long. We're not going to take your offer. Now we're not going to let you even stay in France anymore. We are going to exile you from your own country. You don't get to be the emperor anymore. So all these other countries, they took Napoleon prisoner, and they sent him to this little island off the coast of Italy. It's called Elba, and he was in exile there. They said, you can't come back to France. You're basically going to be the prisoner of this island. You can be the boss of that island. There were about 10,000 people who lived on that island, so he became like their boss. And actually, while he was there, he improved their schools and their roads and all these great things he did for the island, but he was restless. He did not want to stay there. He was on the island about a year, maybe a year and a half, that's what it was, and he escaped from the island on a ship with some followers. They escaped the island and they landed on France. What's going on in France? Well, now that Napoleon was gone, all these other nations are like, whew, that's over with. Let's find a new king for France. Well, King Louis XVI was dead, so was his wife, and his children had been scattered to the wind. But Louis XVI had a little brother, and they found him. He had been living in Great Britain, and they put him on the throne of France, and they called him King Louis XVIII. And so he was now going to be the king of France. Well, Louis XVIII was happy that Napoleon was out of his hair and on the island, but when Napoleon escapes and ends up back in France, Louis sends some troops to immediately go down and arrest him. And so Napoleon's marching with an entourage of people towards Paris, and these troops come down to arrest him. It was a battalion of men, and this is one of my favorite scenes in world history. Napoleon's coming down the road, and all the people are with him. They see these French troops coming down the road at them. They're going to arrest him, and they've got their weapons out, and they're pointing them right at him. And they say, "Oh no, you're emperor. What should we do?" And Napoleon says, "I'll handle these. Don't worry. Just stay right here." And he gets off his horse and he walks down the road, and all these soldiers are pointing their rifles right at him. And he said, "Here I am, the emperor. You want to kill me? Go ahead, shoot me now. Go ahead. I'm not turning around." They didn't shoot him. They all threw their rifles down. And they went running up to him, "Vive l'Empereur, vive l'Empereur." And they pick him up on their shoulders, and they go running around screaming and shouting, "The emperor's back, woohoo!" And they join his side, and they start marching towards Paris. When King Louis XVIII heard about this, he didn't put together an army. He got the hell out of there. He rode to Belgium and found some refuge there and was hiding out there. Napoleon gets back to France, and he starts putting another army back together again. I don't know where he's finding all these Frenchmen, but he puts together another big army. In the meantime, Great Britain sends over troops. Prussia sends some troops, and they think, we got to take care of this Napoleon one more time. We got to get rid of him. And they end up fighting at this place in Belgium. It's called Waterloo. It's the Battle of Waterloo, 1815, one of the most famous battles in all of world history. And at this battle, Napoleon gets there, and he starts fighting with the British. The Prussians aren't there yet. And Napoleon was not in good shape at this time. He had had some trouble with his stomach. He had hemorrhoids. He had a fever. And on the day of this battle, he was not 100%. And the battle, he's like, if I can just get rid of these British first, and then I'll meet up with the Prussians once they get there. Well, the battle drug on and on and on. And towards the end of the day, it started to rain. And Napoleon had trouble maneuvering his big cannons through these fields in the mud. Then he just stopped fighting for the day. And he was doing all right, but the next morning, the Prussians show up, and he's got to fight these two armies, and he loses once more. That's why today, people refer to as Waterloo as being like your last thing, your last try. His Battle of Waterloo was his last battle he'll ever fight in his life. He's taken prisoner, and they decide to exile him again. But they don't exile him on Elba Island. They're like, that's way too close. They put him on an island that's not even on this map. It's way down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of southern Africa. It's about 1,200 miles from Africa, and it's about 2,000 miles from South America. It's in the middle of the ocean. And it's not a big island. It's only about 10 miles wide, it's 10 miles by 5 miles. It's not a big island at all. And there aren't that many people living there. And the British go down, and they build like a stockade and a nice house for Napoleon, and that's where he's going to live. He's got his #1 generals living with him there too, because they thought, nah, if they let Napoleon's generals live back in France, those generals will immediately start to plot how to get Napoleon back again. So he's basically there with a staff and some people. His wife and his son, they were living, I think, in Austria at the time. They had gotten away. They were going to get to stay in Europe. But he was there on his own, living in his house. He started writing his memoirs. And within a few years, he was dead. Napoleon died when he was 51 years old. They say because he died of stomach cancer. And there are some historians think that the British slowly poisoned him to death, which I wouldn't doubt. But they buried him on the island, and that was the end of his life. Now, they did remove his casket back to Paris later, and now it's on display in Paris. You can visit Napoleon's tomb if you ever go to Paris and see it. And today, Napoleon is not looked at as an evil person in French history. They think he's one of the greatest heroes they ever had. He accomplished more than any one French hero since Charlemagne. So he's quite a big figure in their history books. And that's how we're going to end with Napoleon. We only have a few lessons left, and then it's going to be the end of the year for all of us. And I was just thinking the other day that this would have been the week we would have turned our movies in, and we would have started watching our movies this week. So in my heart, I'm a little sad because we didn't get a chance to do that. But I want you to know that I really miss all of you guys, and I love you, and I wish we could all be together and end our year together. And I'll have a couple more lessons for you, but I won't cram too much down your throats. So I'll see you soon.